In the summer of 1944, Lviv stood at the hinge of converging offensives and competing political projects. Since 1941, the city had been held by German occupation authorities within the general government's district of Galicia and served as a regional hub for rail and road traffic linking Krakow, Przemysl, and the Carpathian passes to Brody, Ternopil, and Kiev. By June or July 1944, the strategic picture had shifted decisively. The Red Army's 1st Ukrainian Front, commanded by Ivan Konev, opened the Lvov Sandomierz Offensive on 13th July with a force on the order of 1,000 personnel, about 2,000 tanks and self-propelled guns, and more than 13,000 guns and mortars. Opposing them, German Army Group North Ukraine mustered roughly 600,000 personnel, near 900 tanks and assault guns, and approximately 6,000 guns and mortars. These figures framed the city's immediate fate: a major Soviet attempt to break Army Group North Ukraine, unhinge its rail network, and force a withdrawal from eastern Galicia toward the Vistula Line. Within Lviv itself, Polish underground structures calculated that the German defense would be temporary and that Soviet entry was imminent. The Home Army, Armia Krajowa, AK, District Lwów, had prepared since late 1943 for the nationwide plan known as Operation Tempest, which intended to synchronize local uprisings with approaching Soviet forces. The underlying premise was political as much as military. By revealing Polish command on liberated ground, AK commanders aimed to reassert the authority of the Polish underground state and the government in exile in London, and to present Soviet forces with a functioning Polish administration. In the city and its suburbs, mobilization lists foresaw several thousand armed participants. In practice, stocks of rifles, pistols, a limited number of light and medium machine guns, grenades, and scarce anti-armor means constrained effective numbers. Captured Panzerfausts appeared sporadically, but purpose-built anti-tank weapons were rare. Ammunition and medical supplies were finite and difficult to replenish under occupation controls. The German command saw Lviv as part of an intertwined operational problem: the need to stabilize a front collapsing after the defeat at Brody and to maintain evacuation routes to the west. The city's garrison combined Wehrmacht security and fortress units. Police formations and ad hoc combat groups formed from rear area personnel, with support from field units falling back through the urban zone. Defensive preparations focused on intersections, rail yards, bridges over the Poltva, and approaches from the northeast and east. Urban defenses were built around strong points in masonry buildings and key squares, with barricades, machine gun nests, and expedient anti-tank obstacles. The immediate objective was delay, to hold long enough for heavy equipment and administrative offices to withdraw, and to prevent encirclement that would mirror the recent destruction of German forces at Brody. Soviet operational priorities treated Lviv as both a tactical objective and a political symbol. For 1st Ukrainian Front, the capture of the city promised a junction for supply to forward armored formations and a step toward bridgeheads on the Vistula. Armored and mechanized groupings driving on the city were tasked to bypass or penetrate urban resistance quickly to keep tempo. The Red Army's urban doctrine emphasized close artillery support, assault groups with sappers, submachine gunners, and flamethrowers, and the use of direct fire guns against fortified buildings. Air support, while substantial at the front level, was sensitive to weather and proximity to friendly forces once street fighting began. Intelligence estimates derived from reconnaissance and partisan reporting suggested that German forces would attempt to trade ground for time rather than conduct a stand to the last, but command also accounted for possibilities of counterattacks launched from within the city or along the arterial roads. Civilian conditions shaped all calculations. Pre-war Lviv had a Polish majority with substantial Ukrainian and Jewish communities. By 1944, the Jewish population had been decimated by German exterminatory policies, while the broader countryside had seen acute Polish-Ukrainian violence. Inside the city, food distribution, medical services, and housing had been strained by requisitions, labor drafts, and air raids. The AK maintained clandestine liaison cells not only for mobilization, but also for civil order, intending to activate police, communications, and municipal services once the Germans withdrew. Ukrainian political organizations inside the city watched the front approach with their own expectations. Some anticipated that Soviet return would be followed by arrests of nationalist activists. Others weighed the implications of German retreat and the possibility of short-term self-defense formations. The atmosphere among civilians was therefore mixed, combining anticipation of frontline relief with apprehension about the means by which control would change hands and the identity of the authorities who would claim it. Events to the north and northeast provided a template and a warning. In early July, Operation Ostra Brama in Vilnius had seen AK units emerge to cooperate tactically with the Red Army in the city's capture, after which the NKVD disarmed many AK formations and detained officers. AK leadership in Lviv took note but did not abandon the Tempest concept. The calculus was that the city's size, the concentration of Polish underground forces, and the visibility of municipal administration could strengthen a Polish negotiating position. Orders thus set timelines for mobilization, keyed to the outer defensive ring and the first Soviet probes, with the aim of raising Polish flags on public buildings and fielding mixed assault and security detachments to demonstrate control of streets and services. On the German side, staff officers tracked the advance of Soviet 3rd Guards Tank Army and 13th and 60th Armies, and they measured the risk that Lviv could become a pocket if armored spearheads broke through to the northwest. Rail dispatches and logistic logs show priority given to fuel, medical units, and communications equipment. Demolition plans for bridges and depots were activated with delayed charges intended to deny use to the attacker after a controlled withdrawal. Field reports noted the possibility of attacks by underground groups coincident with Soviet entry, and directed that police and security battalions conduct intensified sweeps of suspected assembly points. The Polish Underground State's civilian branch, Delegatura, outlined interim administrative steps, restoration of municipal offices, reopening of hospitals under Polish supervision, and protection of archives. Radio links to London carried expectations that the Tempest framework would signal continuity of Polish sovereignty in a city annexed by the Soviet Union in 1939 and reorganized under German occupation after 1941. At the same time, Soviet political preparations advanced. On 22 July 1944, the Polish Committee of National Liberation issued a manifesto declaring itself the legitimate authority on liberated Polish territory, aligning with Soviet objectives and setting the stage for dual claims once cities changed hands. The result was a layered contest. The tactical battle in the streets of Lviv would coincide with an administrative competition over whose officials, uniforms, and seals would appear first in offices, police stations, and radio studios. By the third week of July, the prerequisites for a clash inside the city were complete. Soviet armored and infantry formations approached the urban perimeter. German commands decided between delaying actions and selective withdrawals. AK groups calculated when to move from concealment to open formation. Intelligence on all sides acknowledged that urban ground would multiply the value of small units familiar with the terrain. The immediate conditions, force ratios at the front level, limited underground armament, evacuation pressures on the garrison, and overlapping political blueprints set the parameters for the fighting that would begin within days, and for the competing narratives that would be attached to its outcome. At dawn on 22-23 July 1944, the first signs that the front had reached the city appeared on the northeastern approaches. Soviet reconnaissance elements probing ahead of infantry echelons tested German outposts along the Brody and Zolochev roads, while artillery ranging shots began to fall on rail sidings and road junctions. Inside Lviv, the AK District Command activated the Tempest timetable. Mobilization points, previously organized by street and parish, opened in apartments, workshops, and school basements. Runners delivered sealed envelopes to section leaders confirming phase lines and passwords. The city was divided into operational zones: Śródmieście, central districts, Wychakov to the east, Zamarstynów to the north, and the industrial belt toward Kleparów and Persenkiwka, each with assault and security platoons sapper teams, and a small medical detachment. The immediate instruction was to wait for unmistakable signs that German units were beginning to vacate key facilities, then to strike at communications nodes, telephone exchanges, the main post office, power switching stations, and traffic choke points controlling bridges over the covered Polfa Canal. German headquarters, receiving reports of Soviet armored concentrations crossing the Bug and pressure on the Brody salient, ordered a hold and evacuate sequence. Storage depots prioritized fuel and radio equipment. Rolling stock was marshaled for westbound movements. Demolition parties emplaced charges at rail spurs and warehouses for use upon abandonment. Security battalions augmented strong points at the Citadel complex, the rail yards, and major intersections. Street barricades appeared at approaches to administrative buildings and around gendarmerie posts. Patrols intensified identity checks and curfews, aware that underground formations could exploit the confusion once field units began to move. The local German command's intent was to delay street by street only as necessary to cover the withdrawal corridors running toward Przemyśl, and to prevent armed groups from assuming overt control before Soviet troops entered. By the evening of 23rd July, small arms fire became frequent on the periphery as Soviet forward detachments encountered German outposts in the eastern suburbs. In response, AK assault sections initiated limited actions designed to disrupt communications without revealing full strength prematurely. Teams cut telephone lines in selected trunks to delay German coordination while leaving others intact to monitor traffic. Sappers prepared to immobilize light vehicles with caltrops and improvised obstacles at predetermined corners. A handful of captured Panzerfausts were distributed to two-man anti-armor teams, tasked to cover narrow streets where a single disabled vehicle could block movement. Crucially, liaison officers moved to establish contact with Soviet commanders approaching from the east, carrying written identification and agreed phrases intended to present AK units as Allied local forces responsible for maintaining order behind the advancing front. The first substantive engagements inside the city core occurred on the night of 23 to 24 July. An AK detachment seized a secondary exchange and a local postal substation after short firefights, capturing radios and codebooks of limited value, but gaining access to rooftops that overlooked nearby crossroads. Another group attempted to enter a police post to free detainees, but withdrew after encountering machine gun fire from the upper floors. German reaction was rapid. Street sweeps by mixed police-army squads searched stairwells and courtyards. Several suspected assembly points were raided, forcing underground units to shift safe houses. The immediate outcome was partial. Underground forces gained some tactical footholds, but did not yet control contiguous blocks. Simultaneously, Soviet artillery units increased fire density on the eastern railway approaches and depots. Registration shifted from interdiction fire to preparation patterns supporting assault groups. Civilian movement contracted further as shelling reached inner districts. Hospitals and improvised aid stations began receiving wounded from both German and underground skirmishes, as well as from shell splinters. The AK's civil branch quietly activated lists for municipal services, crews to clear debris, personnel to guard water facilities, and volunteers to maintain basic traffic control once major formations began crossing the city. Their planning assumed a narrow window between German withdrawal and the establishment of a new authority, during which Polish administrative presence could be demonstrated. On 21st July midday, forward elements of Soviet infantry made contact with AK guides at the eastern fringe. After verification, several street-level arrangements took shape. Soviet platoons accepted AK scouts to indicate minefields and barricades. AK units agreed to mark positions clearly with white and red armbands and prearranged signals to reduce friendly fire in close quarters. Coordination remained local and practical rather than formalized by written orders. Both sides focused on immediate tactical needs: access routes for guns brought up for direct fire, locations of German machine gun nests, and the quickest way to reach strong points without exposing flanks. The Red Army's operational clock emphasized tempo, penetrate and roll up resistance, while the AK's clock emphasized visibility, raise symbols of Polish authority, and manage basic services. German countermeasures included limited counterattacks by ad hoc battle groups to reopen threatened streets and maintain access to the western exits. Reserve squads with light armored cars conducted quick thrusts against newly erected barricades, using suppressive fire to cover demolition teams, placing charges at infrastructure nodes slated for denial. Bridges were mined with delayed fuses, depots prepared for destruction once last trains departed. Radio traffic recorded requests for additional ammunition and engineer stores. Replies stressed conservation and the priority of withdrawal over static defense. During the night of 24 to 25 July, Soviet assault groups, reinforced with sappers and flamethrower teams, began the methodical reduction of identified strongpoints on the eastern approaches. Fire plans layered indirect and direct fire, mortars softened upper stories. 76mm guns were brought into streets to punch apertures in masonry. Small assault teams cleared stairwells room by room. AK detachments supported by indicating covered approaches and, in selected cases, joining the final assaults on buildings whose occupation would secure intersections, vital to subsequent movement. Civilians in affected blocks relocated to cellars. Volunteer stretcher bearers moved under lulls between barrages. By 25th of July afternoon, the pattern stabilized. In the east and northeast, blocks shifted hands with each push. In central districts, German strongpoints held but thinned as units peeled away. In the north and west, traffic toward evacuation routes continued under intermittent shelling. The AK's efforts focused on consolidating several micro-sectors, clusters of streets where they could keep continuous passage for medical and supply movement, and on signaling to incoming Soviet commanders that local order was being maintained by identifiable Polish units. This was not yet administration, but it was the skeleton of one. Lists of requisition vehicles, marked routes for ambulances, guards posted at waterworks, and liaison notes logging incidents to present later as evidence of functioning authority. The line between opening phase and full urban battle blurred on 26 July, with additional Soviet formations entering the city's perimeter. Combined pressure accelerated German withdrawals from non-essential positions, and concentrated remaining defenders at the Citadel area, rail yards, and selected administrative buildings. Fire grew heavier along axes leading to these nodes. The AK, now more openly present in several districts, directed civilians away from streets expected to become corridors for gun tractors and supply columns. At the same time, underground commanders documented instances of cooperation with Red Army units, joint patrols on specific streets, shared use of buildings as temporary posts, anticipating that the record would matter when authority over the city became a political question. The opening phase thus closed not with a single signal, but with a convergence of three processes: the Red Army's entry into street fighting, the German garrison's transition from citywide delay to point defense and demolition, and the Home Army's shift from covert disruption to overt participation in the contest for control of space and services. Strategic intentions for each participant converged on the same space but diverged in purpose. For the Red Army, Lviv was a junction on the Lvov-Sandomierz axis. Operational orders framed the city as a node whose capture would free arterial rail lines for the advance toward the Vistula and enable supply to armored groups tasked with forcing bridgeheads on the river. The planning matrix set phased objectives: encircle or fracture German defenses east and north of the city, insert assault groups to seize crossings and rail yards, and prevent the garrison from organizing a cohesive retreat. Artillery deployments were planned to deliver concentrated fires on depots and strong points while preserving key infrastructure needed for logistical throughput. Assault detachments paired submachine gunners with sappers and flamethrower teams, supported by 76mm and 122mm direct fire guns for building reduction. Air armies were tasked for interdiction of columns withdrawing toward Przemysl, and for strikes on marshalling yards outside dense civilian districts once ground forces entered close combat. The supply plan projected quick reconstitution of rail service east of the city after repair of track and bridges, with motor columns bridging the gap during the transition. German planning accepted that positional defense on the approaches would yield to mobile delay inside the urban grid, Army Group North Ukraine treated Lviv as a hinge. The city was to cover withdrawal corridors and protect the transfer of men and materiel toward the San and Vistula. The concept of defense allocated scarce armor to short counterthrusts, designed to reopen blocked routes and extract units from encirclement risks. Fortress and security battalions were tasked to hold clusters of strong points tied to the Citadel, rail yards, and communications hubs. Engineers prepared layered demolitions with delayed fuses at bridges, warehouses, and fuel stores to deny Soviet use. Ammunition rationing orders prioritized machine gun belts, mortar bombs, and anti-tank rounds for point defense lines, while small quantities of assault guns or armored cars were assigned to night sorties against barricades. Logistics instructions emphasized dispatching rolling stock before the final phase, relocating repair workshops, and burning documents not evacuated. The propaganda line to civilians highlighted the danger of frontline chaos and urged compliance with curfews. Internal guidance warned of sabotage by underground groups and authorized summary demolitions if positions became untenable. The AK District's plan combined military and administrative goals within the national framework of Tempest. The military aim was to disrupt German communications, deny orderly evacuation, and assist incoming Soviet units at street level, thereby hastening the fall of the city. The political aim was to manifest the Polish underground state's presence through visible security patrols, protection of utilities, and temporary municipal administration. Orders subdivided the city into operational zones with company and platoon-sized groupings, each assigned a primary objective such as a telephone exchange, a power substation, a rail spur, or a police post. Sapper sections were trained for door breaching, stairwell clearing, and expedient blocking of streets with trams and sand-filled carts. Medical officers positioned aid stations near anticipated fighting corridors and pre-positioned bandages, morphine, and stretchers collected from clandestine sources. Communications relied on couriers and a small number of field telephones. Radio use remained limited to avoid detection. The armament portfolio showed constraints. Rifles of mixed origin, a modest number of light and medium machine guns, pistols, grenades, and a few captured Panzerfausts and magnetic mines. Ammunition expenditure tables were issued to conserve rounds for decisive moments such as seizing a node or repelling a local counterattack. Each side's planning included intelligence estimates shaped by recent precedent. Soviet staff studied urban fights since 1943 and integrated lessons on assault group composition, the need for immediate engineer support, and the value of seizing rooftops for observation. Reports from Vilnius earlier in July showed that cooperation with local underground formations could reduce fratricide risks, but could also produce post-capture complications. German files registered the loss at Brody and identified likely axes of Soviet armor, recommending night transfers and camouflage discipline to minimize air interdiction. Security services mapped suspected underground cells by block and prioritized raids at mobilization times. The AK assessed German readiness to demolish infrastructure and therefore planned guard details at waterworks and power junctions to deter or delay destruction. It also issued guidance on armband markings and recognition signals to reduce the chance of being treated as hostile by the Red Army once joint contact occurred. Logistics framed what was feasible. The Red Army's artillery plan required ammunition columns that could keep pace on damaged roads. Bridging sets were earmarked for the Poltva crossings and culverts along feeder streets. Signal units prepared to extend field cable across intersections for forward observers, while avoiding exposed spans vulnerable to small arms fire. German logistics depended on the timing of rail departures and the availability of fuel. Contingency tables specified quantities of ammunition to be blown if stockpiles could not be moved. Wounded evacuation routes were drawn to hospitals west of the city center, with alternative sites marked, if shelling cut, primary streets. The AK's supply lines were hyper-local, caches in apartments, workshops, and sacristies, food and medical supplies collected through civil networks, and improvised transport using handcarts, bicycles, and requisitioned vehicles documented to retain accountability for later claims. Preparation also encompassed information campaigns. Soviet leaflets dropped ahead of the front called for civilians to stay clear of combat zones and for German soldiers to surrender at named assembly points. German proclamations warned against aiding saboteurs and threatened penalties for possessing weapons. The underground distributed concise notices instructing residents on blackout, cellar safety, and the location of first aid points. All three actors sought to manage civilian movement to reduce interference with military operations and to shape perceptions of who would exercise authority after the shooting stopped. Miscalculations were embedded in the plans. German schedules assumed that rear area units could execute demolitions in sequence without interruption by local attacks or sudden penetrations. Soviet planners accepted risk by projecting rapid clearance of inner districts while maintaining pressure on exits, a dual task that could stretch assault groups thin. The AK plan counted on a narrow window in which joint tactical cooperation would translate into political recognition, although earlier cases suggested that security organs might intervene quickly to disarm non-Soviet armed formations. These assumptions would be tested as the flow of the battle forced faster decisions than written orders could anticipate. In sum, planning for Lviv in late July set three intersecting clocks. The Red Army synchronized artillery, engineers, and assault infantry to maintain momentum through a dense city. The German command synchronized withdrawals, demolitions, and short counterattacks to retain exit corridors. The AK synchronized mobilization, tactical assistance, and administrative activation to demonstrate local governance. The alignment or misalignment of these clocks, measured in hours at intersections, bridges, depots, and stairwells, would shape the first decisive engagements inside the city, and the political claims advanced in their wake. Street fighting began as overlapping micro-battles rather than a single, continuous front. In the late hours of 23rd of July, assault groups from Soviet infantry divisions pushed into the eastern blocks of Wytsakov behind short, heavy artillery preparations. Standard assault composition, sappers with pole charges and wire cutters, squads armed largely with submachine guns, and a support element with 76mm guns brought forward for direct fire, met German machine gun nests positioned to command intersections from upper floors. Where elevation and angle permitted, the attackers employed direct fire guns to punch entry holes through masonry at close range, bypassing stairwells that were covered by overlapping arcs. The first gains were measured in buildings and courtyards. Stairwell by stairwell clearance secured rooftops for observers, which in turn enabled more accurate mortar fire across the narrow streets. Home Army detachments moved in the same grid with different tasks. Small AK teams had pre-marked wire junctions and telephone cabinets. Once firing masked movement, sappers reached cabinets and cut selected trunks, forcing German posts to rely on runners. In two instances documented by liaison notes, AK teams guided Soviet platoons along courtyards that avoided registered kill zones on the street and pointed out a camouflage machine gun in a school attic that had enfiladed a tram line. Coordination remained local and verbal. There was no integrated command post. To limit fratricide risk, AK personnel wore white-red armbands and used prearranged challenge and response phrases. In several buildings, Soviet assault groups accepted brief attachments of 2 to 3 AK fighters as guides, then separated once the objective was taken. German initial responses blended point defense with calibrated counter-thrusts. Strong points used interlocking machine guns to fix attackers until a small reserve, often a dozen to 2 dozen men with a light mortar and, where available, an armored car, could strike a flank along a side street. These short counterattacks were designed to restore a blocked route or extract a threatened post, rather than hold ground permanently. Engineers prepared stairwell traps and door charges triggered when a landing was occupied. At the Citadel complex, whose masonry walls dominated surrounding streets, defenders used embrasures for rifle and machine gun fire, while mortars ranged onto approaches from 3 directions. From this anchor, the garrison projected patrols to keep the adjacent grid unstable. On 24th of July morning, the first notable territorial shift occurred in the eastern rail approaches, where Soviet units, supported by direct-fire artillery, entered a block of warehouses that covered a feeder line. German demolition plans for this sector had included delayed fuses. A firefight in the yard disrupted the sequence. When explosives detonated, they damaged only the outer sheds rather than the switching cabin and the main spur. This partial failure had two immediate effects. The attackers obtained cover from the still-standing inner walls, and rail repair crews following the assault column found a shorter list of urgent tasks. In the city center, however, German forces maintained control of administrative buildings and the main post office. Attempts by AK sections to disarm police posts met automatic fire from upper floors and were abandoned after brief exchanges. Civilian movement continued to contract towards cellars. Water points drew queues in early hours under improvised rules enforced by ad hoc guards drawn from residents, underground auxiliaries, or, in some cases, soldiers from whichever force held the adjacent corner at that moment. Hospitals recorded a mix of fragment and small arms wounds. The ratio of blast injuries rose in districts where direct fire guns were employed against masonry. The AK's civil branch deployed stretcher bearers with marked armbands and posted notices indicating routes considered safer during hours when barrages slackened. Soviet leaflets urging civilians to avoid main streets appeared at doorways. German proclamations warning against aiding saboteurs were pasted at intersections still under their patrols. The shared objective, reducing interference with combat operations, did not remove the underlying competition over who could credibly claim to be managing the city. By the evening of 24th of July, fighting reached the industrial belt south of the central districts. Here, wider thoroughfares and factory courtyards reduced the advantage of upper-floor positions. Soviet units brought up anti-tank guns to cover avenues likely to receive German armored cars and assault guns. One German push with two armored vehicles and infantry riding on the decks advanced along a tram line to break through a newly erected barricade of sand-filled carts. AK teams, equipped with captured Panzerfausts, held fire until the lead vehicle crossed a narrowing between two brick sheds. A single shot disabled it and blocked the second vehicle's path. The accompanying infantry dismounted and withdrew under covering smoke. The immediate tactical outcome was a temporary hold of the junction by the attackers, which allowed sappers to cut a parallel street and force future traffic into a predictable arc exposed to mortar fire. Night favored infiltration and repeat engagements. The Poltvaz covered course beneath central streets provided no easy subterranean route for either side, but storm drains and inner courtyards did. German patrols used knowledge of service alleys to approach barricades from oblique angles, tossing grenades into ground floor windows before opening with automatic fire. Soviet assault teams countered by posting listening pairs at choke points and firing flare pistols into suspect alleys before crossing. AK scouts, familiar with building interiors, improvised through-wall passages using sledgehammers to avoid known stairwell traps. Casualty evacuation at night relied on handcart teams driven through courtyards with blankets muffling wheels. On 25th of July morning, an unexpected operational effect followed a local tactical decision. A Soviet battalion, after seizing two facing tenements that dominated an intersection in Wytsakov, emplaced a 122mm gun for direct fire onto a building suspected to house a machine gun nest, covering a diagonal street. The blast breached the facade and collapsed part of the internal staircase. Unintended but important, the collapse also blocked the stairwell used by German runners between two strong points, severing their lateral communication. Over the next hours, German counterattacks along that diagonal diminished, and the adjacent Soviet company advanced one block farther than planned, opening a narrow corridor for vehicles to bring up additional ammunition. The gain was not decisive at city scale, but it shifted pressure onto nearby posts and forced the garrison to redistribute reserves. The rail yards became the most contested terrain by midday 25th of July. Control of switching levers and embankment approaches determined whether evacuation trains could continue to depart. German engineers attempted to destroy a set of points with shaped charges under small arms covering fire. An AK detachment that had pre-positioned in a workshop loft engaged the demolition team at close range, delaying them long enough for a Soviet assault group to arrive. The demolition charges were later found wired but not triggered. For several hours, neither side could operate trains through the yard due to fire lanes across the tracks. When firing lulled in late afternoon, a short German train loaded with medical equipment departed under smoke cover, while Soviet artillery shifted to interdiction of the outbound line west of the city. Morale reactions differed by sector. German reports intercepted later indicated increasing fatigue among security battalions rotated into frontline street posts. Their adaptation was to shorten lines and concentrate on protecting exits. Soviet junior commanders emphasized rapid consolidation of captured buildings to prevent counter-infiltration. Their adaptation was to assign small permanent garrisons to key stairwells and junctions, accepting thinner assault lines. AK units balanced ammunition conservation with the need to stay visible. Their adaptation was to focus on tasks that provided measurable effects, guiding columns, securing utilities, and maintaining aid routes, while avoiding attritional contests over buildings that neither they nor the Red Army could afford to garrison in depth. By the night of 25 to 26 July, the pattern of first engagements had crystallized. German control contracted into clusters anchored on the Citadel, main administrative buildings, and segments of the rail yards and western exits. Soviet presence solidified in much of the eastern and northeastern grid, with protrusions toward the center wherever stairwell fights had produced contiguous gains. AK detachments held pockets of influence that overlapped with Soviet lines in some streets and abutted German posts in others, a mosaic that required continual deconfliction at corners and doorways. The first phase closed with 3 measurable results. Several approach corridors for Soviet guns and supply carts now ran through previously interdicted streets. German evacuation continued, but at a slower tempo due to disrupted switching and narrowed routes. And the Home Army's capacity to act as a local security and liaison force had been demonstrated to multiple Soviet company and battalion commanders, creating a record of practical cooperation that its leaders intended to present when municipal authority came under negotiation. Escalation followed when additional formations reached the urban perimeter on 26 to 27 July. Reinforcements arrived for Soviet infantry divisions in the eastern sectors, while forward detachments from mechanized corps pushed reconnaissance groups toward the inner ring. A typical composite detachment numbered 120-180 men with attached sappers and a pair of direct-fire guns, enough to hold newly taken blocks and probe further. Artillery density increased. Battalions of 76 mm and 122 mm guns shifted to fire plans that alternated short concentrations with rapid displacement to avoid counter-battery fire. Supply carts and light trucks moved ammunition along corridors cleared house by house the previous day. The pace of operations generated a new problem, maintaining communications under rubble and cut cables, which signal units addressed by laying field wire across stairwells and rooftops, while runners carried sketch maps updated after each block changed hands. German command compressed the defense to conserve personnel and ammunition. Security battalions and fortress companies were consolidated into mixed Kampfgruppen of 200-400 men, each assigned a cluster of strong points with pre-planned fallback lines. Mortar ammunition and machine gun belts were rationed by sector. Priority went to the Citadel approaches, the rail yards, and arteries leading to western exits. 2 to 4 assault guns or armored cars, where available, were reserved for short counter-thrusts, designed to break temporary encirclements or escort demolition teams. Engineer files show layered demolition schedules. First, minor depots and non-essential sheds. Second, fuel dumps and bridge spans. Third, switching cabins and substations only if withdrawal became impossible. Executing these sequences under fire proved difficult. In several cases, assault pressure forced premature detonations that denied defenders the cover they had intended to use for later delays. The Home Army shifted from dispersed harassment to concentrated support roles aligned with its limited ammunition. Company-size groupings defended narrow sectors around utility nodes and aid routes, typically 80-120 fighters with a few light or medium machine guns and a handful of captured Panzerfausts. Liaison teams, 2-4 officers or NCOs fluent in Russian, rotated between Soviet company posts to register recognition signals, deconflict patrol times, and present lists of streets where AK patrols claimed responsibility for order. The underground also issued written receipts for requisitioned vehicles and food, recording addresses and quantities in anticipation of post-battle accountability. Ammunition registers show conservative expenditure. Riflemen held to 40 to 60 rounds each for the day's actions. Machine gun teams planned belts for 2 to 3 defensive bursts per hour at most. Casualty loads rose and strained medical arrangements. Soviet battalion aid posts reported increasing proportions of blast and burn injuries from flamethrower and direct-fire gun employment inside buildings. German medical sections concentrated in cellars near strong points and evacuated westward by handcart at night when possible. Underground aid stations, using civilian doctors and nurses, received mixed casualties, fighters and residents, with triage that prioritized bleeding control and fracture stabilization pending movement to hospitals. By late 26 July, several hospitals operated at or beyond capacity. Corridors held stretchers, and improvised operating tables appeared in basements. Water supply interruptions, caused by broken mains near contested intersections, increased the risk of infection. The AK posted guards at pumping stations and organized bucket relays to keep boilers and sterilization equipment running. Command and control faced cumulative stress. Soviet battalion commanders struggled to maintain momentum with companies dispersed across non-contiguous blocks. The solution was to designate spines of control, 2 or 3 parallel streets to which platoons had to fall back for coordination at preset hours. German sector leaders faced the inverse problem, maintaining continuous lines with shrinking manpower. They shortened frontage by abandoning outer houses and barricading inner courtyards that offered overlapping fire from upper stories. The price was loss of lateral communication when stairwells collapsed. Runners took detours through attics and service alleys. Message times doubled, and counterattacks sometimes launched after the window for effect had closed. The AK's distributed network proved resilient to single-point failures, but vulnerable to targeted raids. When a safe house was compromised, courier routes had to be redrawn, delaying planned deliveries of grenades and medical kits. Terrain amplified small tactical decisions into sector-level effects. At one junction near the eastern rail yard, a Soviet sapper team breached a wall to bypass a mined stairwell. The breach opened a line of sight along a parallel street that observers used to call mortar fire on a machine gun nest covering the yard. The nest suppression enabled a repair crew to move a trolley loaded with rails into position during a brief lull. Conversely, in the central district, a German demolition of a tram underpass collapsed a utility conduit that Soviet signals had been using as a protected cable route, forcing reliance on runners for several hours and slowing the synchronization of 2 adjacent companies. Such exchanges repeated across blocks. A single disabled armored car blocked an axis for half a day. A burned-out warehouse provided a durable strongpoint once interior beams had fallen into a defensible tangle. Political frictions surfaced as the number of armed actors in the same streets grew. NKVD and Red Army political officers attached to forward units began registering local armed groups and collecting names of commanders. AK liaison teams, while continuing cooperation at company level, documented these interactions and kept parallel records for their own headquarters. Posters appeared announcing a provisional civil order under Soviet military authority. Underground notices asserted that municipal services were operating under Polish responsibility in specific neighborhoods. German propaganda broadcasts, audible on civilian radios, accused saboteurs of endangering residents by provoking street fighting. Soviet leaflets emphasized that order would be maintained by military command. AK broadsides listed addresses of first aid points and warned against looting with the threat of arrest by Polish patrols. None of these statements altered immediate tactical conduct, but they framed the claims that would be advanced once fire slackened. Weather and light conditions influenced escalation patterns. Afternoon heat dried debris and increased the risk of secondary fires after flamethrower use. Night brought cooler air and fog patches near the Poltva's course, which reduced visibility for machine gunners covering long streets. Soviet units used pre-dawn twilight for short assaults preceded by 10 to 15-minute mortar concentrations. German defenders preferred night for local counter-thrusts and silent withdrawals behind pre-laid obstacles. The AK scheduled most civilian movement, water collection, evacuation to safer cellars, during mid-morning lulls communicated by runners and handbills. External attention intensified, without altering the local balance. Radio monitoring indicated that Polish-language broadcasts from the east reported the advance on Lviv in the context of broader liberation operations, while London-based broadcasts highlighted Polish underground participation under the Tempest framework. German high command communiques presented the fighting as a controlled delay. These narratives did not change ammunition stocks, unit fatigue, or rubble-choked streets, but they shaped expectations among civilians about which authority would claim jurisdiction when the firing lines contracted to a few strong points. By 27th of July evening, the crisis phase was evident in three metrics. First, the German garrison's maneuver room narrowed to clusters around the Citadel, remaining administrative buildings, and segments of the rail yards and western exits. Their counterattacks grew shorter in distance and duration. Second, Soviet formations held longer contiguous stretches in the east and southeast, and began to appear along new axes in the north. Artillery shifted from broad interdiction to precision direct fire on named buildings. Third, the Home Army, conserving ammunition, concentrated on securing utilities, escorting medical evacuations, and maintaining liaison with multiple Soviet subunits, thereby preserving its visibility as a local security actor. The convergence of compressed defenses, intensified assault procedures, and parallel administrative claims marked the transition from dispersed engagements to a citywide crisis in which hours at a handful of intersections and stairwells would determine when and how control would pass. The concentration of combat power peaked on 27 July, when pressure on the inner defense ring converged from three directions. Assault groups that had been clearing Wycakov and the rail approaches shifted to methodical reduction of strong points controlling access to the city center and the Citadel. Preparatory fires shortened to conserve ammunition and reduce collateral damage around junctions needed for subsequent movement. Direct fire guns were emplaced at corners with limited arcs to breach selected facades rather than collapse entire structures. Flamethrower sections operated in pairs, one to create a fire curtain across stairwell mouths, the other to clear ground floors, with sappers following to block through passages with debris and sand-filled carts. Infantry sections advanced room by room, leaving small posts to hold stairwells as the main body moved on. The objective was to create corridors for supply carts, signals cable, and gun tractors, not to garrison every seized room. German command concentrated remaining personnel in clusters around the Citadel complex, the main telegraph building, and segments of the rail yard. Mixed groups of 200-300 men, composed of fortress troops, police, and remnants of field units, received the last stocks of mortar rounds and machine gun belts. Short counter-thrusts were still authorized, but limited to regaining a blocking position or covering a demolition. Engineers accelerated denial plans. Stacks of files and communications gear burned in courtyards. Charges placed under stairheads and in culverts were set on shortened fuses. The aim was to force attackers to pause at each node, even if outer rooms were lost. 2 to 4 armored cars or assault guns remained available and were committed at intersections where a single burst could disorganize an assault group and buy time for a withdrawal across an inner yard. Home Army companies, concentrated around utility nodes and pre-selected corridors, shifted from dispersed skirmishing to defined support missions that would be visible in the aftermath. Patrols guarded water-pumping stations and substations, registering personnel and posting notes that the facilities were under Polish responsibility in the name of municipal continuity. Liaison teams maintained contact with adjacent Soviet companies, offering guides for backlot approaches to specific buildings and providing lists of addresses where first aid posts operated. Ammunition conservation remained strict. Panzerfaust teams covered narrow approaches where a vehicle might attempt to reopen a street. Rifle sections were instructed to fire only at named targets, not to exchange bursts across courtyards without clear effect. The AK also documented its actions, times, locations, and cooperating Soviet units. anticipating that such records would be required to substantiate later claims of participation in the city's capture. The decisive local action unfolded in the approaches to the Citadel. Its high masonry and bastions offered overlapping fields of fire across adjacent streets. Soviet assault groups used smoke and short, dense mortar concentrations to mask sappers as they breached outbuildings and created access points into courtyards. A battery of 122 mm guns was brought to within direct fire range, their crews using rubble piles as makeshift revetments to reduce exposure. Fire discipline emphasized single rounds at identified loopholes and embrasures, followed by immediate infantry rushes to prevent defenders from remounting weapons. German mortars answered with high rate of fire, but ammunition stocks, already rationed, dwindled over the morning. 2 brief counterattacks used armored cars to sweep an approach street. One vehicle was disabled by a Panzerfaust fired from a second-story window at short range, blocking the axis and forcing the second car to reverse under small arms and gunfire. By early afternoon, outer buildings abutting the complex were contested floor by floor, and the defenders began pulling to inner positions prepared with demolition charges. Simultaneously, the rail yard became untenable for prolonged defense. Switching levers and approaches had been fought over for 2 days. By midday 27th July, centralized control was no longer possible under fire. A German demolition team succeeded in blasting a minor spur and a warehouse, but a planned destruction of the main switching cabin failed when covering fire was suppressed by a mortar section and placed on a rooftop that AK guides had indicated as a viable observation post. A short outbound train with medical supplies departed under smoke. Subsequent attempts to move rolling stock stalled due to rails blocked by debris and small arms fire lanes across embankments. Repair crews following behind Soviet assault groups marked intact segments and noted that several spans, expected to be destroyed, remained usable after only limited damage. Civilian conditions deteriorated to their worst levels of the week. Fires from flamethrower use and demolitions smoldered in inner courtyards. Buckets and hand pumps could not keep up where mains were broken. Hospitals overflowed. Triage shifted repeatedly to cellars when upper floors became unsafe. Water was rationed by queue at guarded points in districts held by either side, with handwritten sheets indicating hours of relative safety for collection. Evacuation within the city followed narrow windows announced by runners. Elderly and children were moved to basements farther from active sectors. Aid stations operated by underground medical personnel recorded rising infection risk due to limited sterilization. AK guards prioritized keeping boiler rooms running at pumping stations to sustain basic sanitation. Civilians who ventured into streets during lulls for food or water did so under improvised white flags or sheets, a practice tolerated by local commanders when fire slackened but rescinded when counterthrusts were expected. High-level decisions mirrored the tactical culmination. For the Red Army, the risk was that prolonged fighting around the Citadel and central nodes would delay redeployment of artillery and armor toward the west. Orders, therefore, prioritized creating a passage through the city rather than waiting for complete reduction of every strongpoint. This produced a 2-tier effort. Reduction groups continued the systematic assault on the Citadel and adjacent posts, while other units pushed westward along corridors already opened to interdict exits and complete the encirclement of remaining defenders. For the German command, the calculation narrowed to timing, how long to hold inner positions without losing units to encirclement, and when to convert point defense into breakout groups heading for the western edge. Signals traffic, increasingly carried by runners, indicated preparations for night withdrawals from non-critical buildings, and a concentration of the most cohesive troops near routes leading toward Przemyśl. By late afternoon on 27th July, the city center no longer functioned as a continuous defensive grid. Soviet units held contiguous blocks in the east and pushed into streets abutting central squares. German control persisted in islands, Citadel innerworks, several administrative buildings with thick walls, and segments of the western arteries. AK patrols were visible at waterworks and along designated aid corridors, escorting stretcher teams and recording property requisitions with written receipts. Around sunset, a final series of assaults pressed the Citadel perimeter at multiple points under a coordinated fire plan that sequenced mortars, direct fire guns, and infantry rushes defenders detonated pre-laid charges inside stairwells, causing localized collapses, but also limiting their own movement between levels. Shortly after nightfall, organized resistance in outer Citadel buildings ceased. Surviving defenders retreated to inner structures or attempted to slip out along service passages. The night of 27 to 28th, July saw the last German attempts to extract personnel in small groups through the western sectors, using knowledge of alleys and pre-arranged signals at checkpoints. Some detachments reached outbound routes. Others encountered Soviet blocking groups posted earlier to cut arteries. Short firefights erupted at roadblocks where carts and disabled vehicles had been positioned to force traffic into narrow lanes. Sporadic demolitions continued as remaining engineers fired charges at depots and files. In sectors where fighting had ended, Soviet commandant posts appeared in the early hours with instructions for curfew, weapons surrender, and registration. NKVD screening detachments, arriving behind frontline units, began establishing checkpoints to record identities of armed groups and enforce disarmament orders applicable to non-Red Army formations. AK liaison teams, still operating with several Soviet companies, logged these developments while maintaining guard over utilities and aid posts through the night. By the morning of 28th of July, organized German resistance within the central districts had largely ended. Isolated skirmishes persisted on the western edge, where breakout attempts met blocking detachments. The Citadel's remaining inner positions were cleared over the course of the day by combined infantry-engineer teams using direct-fire guns at short range. Soviet units marked captured buildings and assigned small garrisons to key stairwells and intersections to prevent counter-infiltration. Rail repair teams surveyed damage and presented initial timelines for limited service restoration on inner spurs. Road crews began pushing debris to open lanes for supply trucks. The AK shifted personnel from assault support to static security of utilities and documented the locations where Polish patrols had operated openly during the fighting. Civilian movement resumed cautiously within defined hours under posted curfew notices. The peak thus ended not with a single capitulation event, but with the contraction of organized defense to a few nodes, the opening of east-west supply passages through the city, and the first appearance of new regulatory structures. For military staffs, the measure of success lay in corridors cleared and exits sealed. For garrison remnants, in the number of men who reached the western routes. For the underground, in records showing participation and provision of order under fire. Each actor achieved part of its aim under the constraints of rubble-choked streets, depleted stocks, and the presence of a large civilian population. The next phase would test how battlefield cooperation intersected with competing claims to authority, once formal disarmament and security screening began. Resistance and adaptation unfolded in parallel as the shooting lessened in some streets and intensified in others between 28 and 30 July. Soviet battalions that had driven through to the center reconfigured their organizations from assault-heavy stacks to mixed garrison and sweep groupings. A typical post-capture detachment fielded 90 to 140 men, one platoon to hold stairwells and junctions, one to patrol for remaining snipers and sappers, and a small engineer section to search for delayed charges. Tables of equipment shifted accordingly. Fewer flamethrowers, more wire, picks, and mine probes. Command posts established checkpoint sectors with defined radii, usually 300, 500 meters, within which patrols circulated on 2-hour cycles, logging addresses, confiscated weapons, and incidents. Signal units strung cable to provisional commandant offices and marked lines with paper flags to reduce accidental cutting by cleanup crews. German remnants adapted by fragmenting into small groups with reconnaissance knowledge of alleys and service passages, aiming to bypass Soviet blocking points rather than recapture terrain. A residual counterattack capability existed as late as 29 July in the western sectors, where 20 40-man detachments with a light mortar and several machine pistols attempted to open lanes toward outbound roads. Their tactics favored smoke grenades and short, high-volume bursts to disorient street posts, followed by rapid movement through buildings. The countermeasure was predictable. Soviet and AK posts coordinated to preposition obstacles, disabled vehicles, trams, sand-filled barrels, so that even a brief dislocation of a guard post did not translate into a clean passage. By 30th July, these efforts yielded diminishing returns. Many groups short of ammunition and food chose surrender in small clusters when cut off from known routes. The Home Army adjusted to a dual-track environment, continued tactical cooperation at street level with Red Army units, and the arrival of security organs with orders to register and disarm non-state armed formations. Company commanders preserved their core cadres by shifting selected fighters to unarmed roles guarding utilities and aid stations, while keeping small, armed escorts nearby under clothing. Weapons not immediately required were cached in prearranged hide sites, under floorboards, behind masonry inserts, and within roof voids, recorded in duplicate lists held by separate couriers to reduce the risk of complete compromise if one list was seized. Liaison teams maintained daily logs of joint actions with Soviet companies, times, street names, and specific buildings to demonstrate concrete contributions. At the same time, they prepared identity papers and sworn statements for fighters assigned to public-facing tasks to support claims of lawful policing rather than partisan activity. Resource management became the central constraint across all actors. Soviet quartermasters prioritized potable water, medical dressings, and cable spools over heavy munitions now that direct-fire assaults had declined inside the Corps. Repair units triaged rail and road routes. First, open one continuous east-west axis for supply trucks. Second, restore at least one inner-city spur capable of moving a work train. Third, clear rubble from intersections where ambulance movement was most delayed. German holdouts rationed ammunition to single shots and short, 3 to 5 round machine pistol bursts. Food stocks were improvised from apartments entered along the route. Underground medical stores concentrated on disinfectants and bandages, with morphine reserved for procedures and basement operating rooms. Security screening altered the operational environment. NKVD detachments, organized in platoon-sized teams, set up registration points with fixed schedules and posted orders requiring the surrender of weapons by named deadlines. The procedure included identity verification, unit affiliation, and addresses. In several districts, AK representatives presented lists of patrol routes and inventories of previously requisitioned property to show continuity of municipal services. At the household level, compliance varied. Some residents surrendered pistols and grenades acquired during the fighting. Others concealed items in anticipation of future instability. From the Soviet perspective, rapid screening reduced the chance of renewed armed incidents. From the underground perspective, complete disarmament risked eliminating leverage in negotiations about administration. The immediate adaptation was partial compliance accompanied by documentation of cooperation to mitigate suspicion. Information control followed the same pattern of pragmatic convergence and political divergence. Soviet commandant offices issued printed curfew hours, pass systems for essential workers, and standardized forms for requisitions. Loudspeaker announcements instructed civilians to report unexploded ordnance and to avoid moving debris without permission. The AK posted notices at water points and hospitals specifying opening times, priority queues for the wounded and children, and contact names for lost persons. German broadcasts receivable on some sets continued to speak of organized withdrawal to new lines. Their operational effect inside the city was minimal after the 28th, but they complicated rumor control by suggesting imminent counterstrokes. To manage morale, local Soviet and AK patrols increased visible cooperation at aid corridors, escorting stretchers together and jointly directing foot traffic, while avoiding discussions about future jurisdiction. Tactical innovation in the residue fight against snipers and stay-behind sappers produced measurable effects. Soviet engineers used standardized search drills. Two-man probe teams checked stairwells with weighted lines for tripwires. Another team inspected basements for blasting caps and wire runs leading to culverts. In several buildings, they found charges placed under stairheads with 10-15-minute delays intended to detonate after an assault group had passed. Defusing operations reduced injuries among follow-on garrisons. AK guides contributed by identifying non-obvious service entries and attic routes between adjoining buildings, which allowed patrols to approach suspected nests without crossing exposed courtyards. Where isolated German cells attempted to trigger demolitions at substations or water mains, joint patrols moved quickly to secure the sites. Documented incidents indicate that at least 2 such attempts were disrupted when a suspicious cable run was found and traced back to a room containing a firing device. Psychological strain accumulated in quantifiable ways. Hospital logs recorded rising cases of exhaustion among stretcher bearers who had worked continuous shifts. Soviet and AK commanders began rotating these details on 6 to almost 8-hour cycles. Interrogation of captured German soldiers reflected fatigue-driven errors in route selection and timing that led to interception at fixed posts. Among civilians, registration lines formed at commandant offices, with throughput rates posted, typically 50-80 persons per hour, so that queues could be managed without pushing into streets under observation. Curfew violations decreased after the first full day of enforcement, suggesting adaptation to new routines despite uncertainty about longer-term governance. Adaptation also occurred in the legal administrative domain. The Soviet side began issuing stamped permits to Polish-language schools and hospitals to continue operations under supervision, while retaining approval authority for staffing. Underground civil authorities compiled ledgers of births, deaths, and property damage during the fighting, intending to preserve a record independent of Soviet documentation. Property receipts issued by AK patrols during the battle were transcribed into bound volumes with dates, addresses, and signatures to facilitate restitution claims. These parallel systems did not yet collide, but implied future contestation over which records would be recognized. By 30 July, resistance in the kinetic sense had narrowed to sporadic sniping and demolition attempts, while resistance in the institutional sense, control over policing, records, and public order, expanded. The Red Army adapted from assault to stabilization, with layered checkpoints and engineer sweeps. The German remnants adapted from maneuver to evasion and surrender. The Home Army adapted from overt, armed support to a guarded administrative posture that emphasized services, documentation, and selective concealment. Each adaptation responded to immediate constraints: ammunition counts, casualty evacuation capacity, water supply, and to anticipated negotiations about authority. The cumulative effect was a city in which the frequency of gunfire declined, but the number of uniforms and documents increased, and in which the outcomes of the next phase would be decided less by the placement of machine guns than by the sequence of arrests, registrations, and the recognition or rejection of parallel claims to manage the city's daily life. The turning point emerged in administrative orders rather than in a single firefight. During 28-30 in July, Soviet commandant offices formalized control measures across the central districts: fixed curfew hours, pass systems for essential workers, and designated points for surrender of weapons. Field units that had fought through the eastern grid received instructions to hold intersections, secure stairwells, and hand over detainees to security organs. NKVD screening teams, arriving behind assault formations, established layered checkpoints on approach roads and around remaining strong points that were still being reduced. The operational effect was to end the fluid, block-by-block combat phase and to replace it with a cordon and registration regime that changed incentives for every armed actor inside the city. For German remnants, the likelihood of slipping through a shrinking mesh decreased hourly. For the Home Army, whose detachments had guided patrols and guarded utilities and visible armbands, the same visibility now exposed personnel to mandatory registration and disarmament. A sequence of orders defined the new timeline. Commandant notices posted on public buildings required all armed civilians and members of non-Red Army formations to report within set windows, often within 24 hours, for identification and the surrender of weapons under receipt. Additional directives placed key sites, rail junctions, post and telegraph facilities, power substations, pumping stations, under Soviet military protection, with access limited to workers carrying stamped permits. These instructions did not interrupt cooperation already recorded at company level. In several sectors, Red Army posts continued to accept AK guides for searches of cellars and attics where delayed charges might be found. But the formal chain now led from frontline units to commandant offices and screening points, where files were opened, names recorded, and affiliations noted. The tempo of arrests at this stage was initial and selective, aimed at individuals who failed to comply or who were identified by informants as members of illegal armed groups. German attempts to regain initiative after 28th July took the form of narrow breakouts. In the western districts, 2 or 3 dozen men at a time tried to force local posts at night, using smoke grenades and short automatic bursts. These groups carried minimal equipment, machine pistols, hand grenades, and rationed ammunition. Street obstacles placed earlier, trams, barrels, sand-filled carts, limited the tactical payoff of surprise. Blocking detachments posted on flanks could engage with crossfire after brief warnings from listening posts. By 30th July, the number of successful breakouts decreased. Captured personnel reported depleted stocks and confusion about which routes remained open. Isolated sappers attempted to ignite remaining demolition charges at secondary depots and substations. Joint patrols, drawing on building plans and neighborhood knowledge provided by residents and AK guides, disrupted several such attempts by tracing cable runs to firing points. The decisive shift for the AK came when weapons surrender points began operating under security supervision, and when screening moved beyond simple registration to detention of selected commanders and liaison officers. Lists compiled during the fighting, documenting joint patrols, protection of utilities, and aid corridors, were presented at commandant offices to substantiate claims that armed presence had served public order. In some cases, these records facilitated the issuance of temporary passes for identified personnel to continue guarding waterworks and hospitals. In others, screening teams treated armed status under underground authority as incompatible with the new order, and directed detainees to holding locations pending further verification. Company commanders responded with a two-pronged adaptation: partial compliance through surrender of a portion of arms accompanied by detailed receipts, and concealment of core cadres by assigning them to unarmed public-facing tasks, while moving weapons to prearranged caches. The dual approach accepted immediate loss of some materiel to preserve organizational continuity. The battlefield map simplified as administrative control tightened. The Citadel's inner positions were reduced by combined infantry engineer teams. The last organized German resistance inside central districts ended by 28th July, with only sporadic firing on the western approaches during the night. Rail and road repair units documented damage in inventories that prioritized one continuous truck corridor through the city and the rapid reopening of inner spurs for work trains. Water mains ruptured during the fighting were patched at critical junctions. Guards posted by both Soviet commandant offices and AK patrols controlled access to pumping stations, coordinated hours for civilian collection, and monitored boiler rooms to maintain sterilization in hospitals. The flow of civilians to registration points increased, managed through posted throughput rates to keep queues inside courtyards rather than on exposed streets. Narratives diverged as the security phase expanded. Soviet proclamations framed the city's capture as part of a broader liberation operation and emphasized that order would be guaranteed by military and security authorities. Underground notices asserted that municipal services had functioned under Polish responsibility during the battle and pointed to documented protection of utilities and aid corridors as evidence of continued administrative relevance. These texts, posted sometimes on the same walls, reflected competing assumptions about legitimate authority. For residents, immediate priorities remained practical: curfew adherence, access to water and food, retrieval of relatives from hospitals or holding points, and the avoidance of routes where unexploded ordnance had been reported. The turning point also had an informational dimension, measurable in paperwork rather than in territory. During 29 to 31 July, commandant offices standardized forms for identity verification, employment passes, and requisition receipts. NKVD teams opened files that combined photographs, personal details, and affiliations, cross-referenced with lists collected from workplaces and neighborhood committees. Underground civil authorities, anticipating disputes over recognition, organized their own ledgers, deaths and injuries by address and date, lists of requisitions made during the battle with signatures of recipients, and registers of aid delivered to hospitals. These parallel archives were the administrative equivalent of opposed lines on a map, each claimed to represent the city's recent history and to establish a record that could be cited in future decisions about staffing and jurisdiction. The operational consequences of the administrative turning point appeared in small but cumulative changes to the street picture. Joint patrols that had been common on 28-29 July, Soviet squads with attached AK guides, grew rarer by the 30th as security organs took over cordon duties. AK armbands remained visible at some utilities and hospitals, but armed escorts declined in number as surrender and confiscation proceeded. In interviews at screening points, some underground personnel were offered enlistment in Soviet-aligned formations or civilian roles under commandant authority. Others were held pending transfer to investigative sections. The uncertainty altered underground behavior. Couriers shifted to indirect routes, contact times shortened, and fallback addresses were activated for families of detained fighters. The city was quieter in terms of gunfire, but more crowded with uniforms at corners and more regulated in movement. Externally, the fall of Lviv was integrated into operational reporting on the Lvov Sandomierz Offensive. Forward elements redeployed westward. Artillery units once assigned to direct fire in the city joined the effort to interdict withdrawal routes and secure bridgeheads. Inside the city, however, the decisive development was the accumulation of names and documents. The same streets where assault groups had advanced now saw lines at registration points and patrols inspecting passes. For German survivors, the choice was surrender or isolated evasion with dwindling prospects. For the Home Army, the choice was compliance that risked organizational dissolution or concealment that risked detention. For the Soviet command, the priority was to stabilize the rear of an advancing front by ensuring that no independent armed structures remained. By the end of the month, outcomes reflected these choices. Organized German resistance within the city had ceased. Remaining holdouts either surrendered or were captured during sweeps. Soviet commandant offices functioned as the primary authority for movement, labor allocation, and public order. The Home Army's visible role contracted to a handful of locations where prior cooperation and documentation secured short-term permits, while arrests of commanders and liaison officers indicated that the window for negotiated coexistence was closing. The turning point, therefore, was not a last stand at a barricade, but the administrative consolidation that followed combat. The moment when cooperation pathways narrowed into a security protocol that detached street-level coordination from questions of political recognition, setting the conditions for the wave of detentions that would define the immediate aftermath. Combat operations inside the central districts ended by 28th July, with only intermittent firing reported on the western approaches through the night of 28th-29th July as small German detachments attempted to reach outbound routes. Surrender points operated at intersections controlled by Soviet posts. Captured personnel were processed in groups of 5 to 20, searched, and moved to holding areas near the rail yards before transfer to the rear. Statements taken from prisoners indicated mixed compositions in the last-ditch detachments, fragments of security and fortress units, convalescents drawn into defense, and stragglers from the field formations broken at the approaches. Evacuation of German wounded continued for several hours after major resistance ceased, under a local arrangement that allowed handcarts to cross defined lanes during lulls. By 29th July afternoon, organized exits had closed and remaining holdouts either surrendered or were found during building sweeps. Stabilization orders followed immediately. Soviet commandant offices posted curfew hours, pass requirements for movement, and schedules for the surrender of weapons held by civilians or members of non-state armed groups. Engineer units prioritized clearance of debris on one continuous east-west corridor and restoration of minimal rail service on inner spurs to bring in work trains with sleepers, rails, and cable. Signals established fixed lines from the commandant to district posts, and patrol routes were mapped with reference points at tram junctions and landmark buildings to standardize reporting. Hospitals, overloaded from days of fighting, were placed under protection with guards at entrances and boiler rooms to secure sterilization capacity. Water collection times were fixed by district. Queues formed under notice boards listing hours and advising residents to report unexploded ordnance to patrols rather than attempting removal. The civilian aftermath was measurable in numbers of displaced families, treatment loads, and infrastructure outages. Hospital ledgers recorded a transition from blast and small arms trauma to infections, burns, and fractures incurred during cleanup. Aid stations that had functioned in basements during the battle consolidated into larger facilities, with throughput triage to surgical cases, fracture stabilization, and dressings. Electric service returned unevenly. Some blocks regained power within days, while others waited for transformer replacement ordered after inspections. Food distribution combined military rations in limited quantities with requisitions documented by receipts. Underground civil lists of earlier requisitions were brought to commandant offices to synchronize records, though decisions about restitution or replacement were deferred. For the Red Army, the immediate priority after the capture was to free combat units for operations to the west, while leaving sufficient garrison and security forces to maintain order. Assault battalions that had fought through inner districts were rotated out for rest or reassigned to blocking lines on the city's western exits. Artillery used for direct fire in the streets redeployed to interdict withdrawal routes and support the advance toward the Vistula crossings. Commandant posts expanded to include administrative sections handling labor allocation, building permits for emergency repairs, and pass issuance for essential workers, rail, power, water, and hospital staff. NKVD detachments formalized screening at registration points, opening files with identity photographs, addresses, employment details, and affiliations. German formations no longer existed in organized clusters inside the city after 29th July. Remaining elements outside the urban grid attempted to reach new positions under Army Group North Ukraine's shifting line, or were taken prisoner in the environs. Material losses inside the city included destroyed or disabled light armored vehicles at intersections, burned warehouses in the industrial belt, and damaged segments of the rail yards. However, several switching points and spans expected to be destroyed remained intact due to premature detonations or disrupted demolition sequences. This allowed repair crews to estimate limited rail movement within days for work trains, though long-distance traffic awaited further clearance west of the city. The Home Army entered the aftermath with two parallel records: logs of street-level cooperation with Red Army companies and inventories of services maintained, water, power, medical evacuation during combat. These were presented at commandant offices to substantiate claims for continued participation in municipal order. In several districts, AK patrols retained visible roles at utilities and hospitals under temporary passes. In others, security screening moved swiftly from registration to detention. Between 29th of July and the first days of August, NKVD teams arrested selected AK commanders, liaison officers, and fighters identified as having retained arms or as leaders of underground structures. Weapons surrendered under receipt were inventoried. Additional caches were discovered during searches triggered by informant tips or routine sweeps. Some underground members accepted offers to join Soviet-aligned Polish formations or to serve in civilian roles under commandant supervision. Others dispersed, shifted to unarmed status, or attempted to conceal themselves using fallback addresses prepared earlier. The administrative environment tightened in stages. Registration lines were processed at posted rates to prevent crowding in exposed streets. Identity papers were stamped with district codes. Passes indicated hours and routes of authorized movement. Labor allocations drew on professional rosters to assign electricians, fitters, and track workers to priority repairs. Parallel to these measures, detentions expanded from individuals flagged at screening to broader roundups of personnel associated with underground command and communications. Transfers moved detainees from district holding points to larger facilities for interrogation and relocation to the rear. Families sought information at commandant offices, where notice boards listed procedures for inquiries and items needed for parcels. Confirmations were often delayed pending file consolidation. Public space reflected two liberation narratives that did not converge. Soviet proclamations framed the city's capture within the Lvov, Sandomierz Offensive and emphasized reconstruction under military authority. Underground notices, when permitted, asserted continuity of Polish civic effort during fighting and documented specific acts, guarding waterworks, escorting medical convoys, defusing charges, as evidence of participation in liberation. The presence of two document trails, commandant files and underground ledgers, created a layered memory in real time. Residents carried passes from one office while preserving receipts from another, uncertain which would be recognized in the longer term. Quantifiable indicators marked the transition from battle to occupation. Street patrol reports shifted from firefights to curfew violations, theft prevention, and ordnance disposal calls. Hospital admissions declined from peak battle days but remained elevated due to secondary injuries during rubble clearance. Rail movement within the city resumed at low volume with work trains. Road convoys increased along the newly cleared corridor, carrying engineer stores and administrative personnel. Surrendered weapons tallies rose as deadlines expired. Discovery of hidden arms continued intermittently. Arrest figures, while not publicly posted, could be inferred from the increasing number of transfers listed in commandant schedules and the reduction of visible AK armbands outside utilities and hospitals. Withdrawal in the military sense and aftermath in the civil sense thus overlapped. Red Army units withdrew westward to sustain operational momentum. German remnants withdrew or were captured. The Home Army withdrew from overt armed roles into documentation, appeals, or concealment. Immediate consequences for the population centered on regulation, curfews, passes, requisitions, and on hazards, unexploded ordnance, unstable structures, and interrupted services. For city governance, the decisive fact of the aftermath was institutional. Security screening and arrests translated battlefield control into administrative control, while competing records of service and authority preserved alternate claims about how the city had been taken and by whom it was kept functioning during the days when fire ran through its streets. The legacy of the July 1944 fighting in Lviv rests on military method, administrative outcomes, and divergent political memory. On the operational plane, the reduction of urban strongpoints by the First Ukrainian Front entered staff histories as a case of assault group doctrine applied to a large, densely built city while preserving selected infrastructure for onward logistics. The sequence, short preparatory fires, direct fire guns against masonry, paired flamethrower and sapper teams, and rapid establishment of stairwell garrisons, reappeared in after-action notes and influenced planning for subsequent crossings to the Vistula. Repair units' ability to open a truck corridor and restore limited rail movement within days validated the approach of holding fire against key assets while destroying German command posts and weapons positions. For German staffs, the episode recorded the limits of fortress labeling and layered demolitions. Once maneuver room contracted and evacuation schedules collided with interdiction and local counterattacks lacking depth. The measured outcome was a garrison extracted in fragments, infrastructure denied only in part, and a rear area security structure unable to prevent internal disruption at the moment of withdrawal. For the Home Army, the engagement became a principal case study in the Tempest concept. Reveal the underground state as a local authority at the moment of liberation by aiding the attacking army, securing utilities, and documenting continuity of municipal services. Tactical cooperation with Red Army companies, guiding patrols, marking routes, and guarding pumping stations and hospitals provided the material needed to claim participation in the city's capture. The subsequent security phase, during which NKVD screening detached street-level cooperation from political recognition and moved to disarm and arrest selected cadres, produced a different institutional result. The underground preserved partial records and networks, but lost freedom to operate openly. The lesson derived by underground planners and later historians was twofold. First, at the level of a district fight, Tempest could accelerate collapse of an occupation administration and mitigate civilian risk at utilities and hospitals. Second, at the level of state power, visibility of a non-Soviet armed structure triggered security procedures that treated it as incompatible with the new administration. Administrative consolidation in late July and early August anchored the long-term transformation of the city. Commandant offices standardized passes, labor allocations, and requisition receipts. Screening points opened files for residents and armed participants. Utilities were subordinated to military protection, with staffing permits issued on a case-by-case basis. These steps aligned Lviv with the broader legal and political framework announced by the Polish Committee of National Liberation on 22 July and by Soviet authorities administering recaptured territories. In parallel, the underground's ledgers, requisitions by address, escort logs for medical convoys, lists of charges diffused, survived in personal archives and post-war publications as counter-records of local governance during combat. The presence of two paper trails meant that later commemorations, claims, and academic syntheses drew on different documentary bases and reached different conclusions about who exercised legitimate authority in the city when fire slackened. The civilian dimension of the legacy is visible in demographic and institutional change rather than in a single statistic. Hospital logs show the shift from blast and gunshot trauma to infection, burns, and clearance injuries. Municipal files record the staged restoration of power and water. Transport records note limited rail movement for work trains within days, and the reopening of a continuous road corridor for convoys. Over the following months and years, border changes and resettlement policies reshaped the population and staffing of schools, universities, and cultural institutions. These processes placed the July battle within a longer arc in which Lviv moved from German occupation through a short mixed phase of overlapping patrols and notices into a Soviet-administered urban order, integrated with the Ukrainian SSR's structures. Comparative frames reinforce the city's dual narrative. In Vilnius earlier in July, AK units also emerged to fight alongside Red Army formations, and were then disarmed. In Warsaw, a week after Lviv's capture, the underground launched an urban rising without coordinated frontline support. Lviv sits between these cases, significant local cooperation in block-by-block fighting, followed by a screening regime that treated the underground as an illegitimate armed actor. For Soviet military histories, the city's fall is part of the Lvov Sandomierz Offensive, a sequence of breakthroughs culminating in bridgeheads on the Vistula. For Polish underground histories, it is a Tempest chapter demonstrating both military contribution and the political limits of that contribution under the emerging post-war order. Ukrainian local histories integrate both threads while situating the event within the city's wartime violence, institutional recovery, and subsequent cultural and administrative realignments. The material culture of remembrance reflects these strands. Memorial dates mark the city's capture within the offensive timeline. Commemorations by veterans groups note AK participation in specific districts and utilities. Plaques and cemetery records list Red Army, AK, and civilian dead by dates corresponding to the street fighting and to later executions or deaths in custody. Archives hold commandant orders, NKVD registration cards, underground receipts, hospital ledgers, and engineering work orders. Each set of documents supports a different emphasis: liberation and reconstruction under a new authority, a local contribution embedded within a broader state project, or a civic effort documented by a non-state administration during combat and eclipsed by a subsequent security regime. Doctrinally, the city became a reference for interforce deconfliction and for the administrative turn that follows urban capture. Assault units refined recognition measures to reduce fratricide when operating near local auxiliaries. Engineers developed standardized search drills for delayed charges in stairwells and culverts. Commandants formalized throughput rates for registration and pass issuance to keep queues off exposed streets. Security organs drew procedural lessons about sequencing disarmament with the reopening of utilities and transport. The underground codified dispersal of records, caching procedures, and fallback roles for cadres assigned to unarmed public-facing tasks under a new administration. These adaptations appeared in manuals, training notes, and post-war memoirs across multiple languages and institutions. Strategically, the capture of Lviv contributed to the operational goal of sustaining the westward advance. By reducing the city in days rather than weeks, the First Ukrainian Front preserved momentum toward the Vistula and freed artillery and assault units for bridgehead operations. German withdrawals from the urban area did not generate a new line inside the city, and the partial survival of switching points and spans assisted Soviet logistics. The underground's effect, while not decisive at front scale, was measurable in protected utilities, escorted medical movements, and local intelligence that shortened specific assaults or prevented demolitions. Civilian survival and the speed of service restoration shaped public order in the weeks immediately following, influencing acceptance of curfews, passes, and labor assignments under the commandant system. The historiographical debate centers on how to weigh these layers. One side emphasizes the city's place in a theater-level offensive and the legality of consolidating state control by disarming other armed structures. Another foregrounds the documented local contribution of the underground and the subsequent arrests as evidence of a political outcome that diverged from battlefield cooperation. A third integrates both readings and situates them in the city's longer 20th century transitions. The episode's significance, therefore, lies not only in the cleared intersections and reduced strong points, but also in the administrative files and underground ledgers that preserved parallel claims. In Lviv, July 1944 produced both an operational result, an open corridor for an advancing front, and an archival result, two narratives of liberation, each grounded in records created in the same streets, during the same days, under different seals.